Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
You know that dull click in your chest when something you already expected still manages to hurt. The way a bruise you forgot about flinches when the grocery cart bumps it, because that was me on my so-called birthday morning. Skimming past the calendar tile on my phone like it was spam and telling myself I was absolutely fine while I slid into a pair of jeans that still smelled faintly like the dryer sheets my mother buys in bulk, and I promised I would not make a big thing out of it. Not this year. Not after 4 straight years of being the family afterthought, and yet there I was doing the little pep talk anyway, the one where I pretend indifference tastes better than disappointment. The plan had been harmless and small and adult in that sad funny way adulthood turns into, because I thought I would work a full day, buy myself a cupcake from the bakery 2 blocks from my apartment where the owner knows I like salted caramel and not too much frosting, and maybe FaceTime my friend Melissa if she got off early from the hospital. And I was sincerely prepared to call it a win if I made it to bedtime without crying in the shower. Yet 10 minutes into my lunch break, while I ate leftover pasta out of a plastic container and tried not to notice that my coworkers had remembered my birthday last year and were conspicuously quiet this year because I stopped telling people, my phone lit up with the kind of glossy, cinematic cruelty you only find on social media. A boomerang of my little sister Sarah twirling a keyring with a giant red bow dangling from it like a Christmas ornament in July, except it was April and the caption said, "She deserves the world." And there were my parents framing her like a campaign ad, beaming and clapping and pretending the driveway reveal had not been rehearsed 3 times, because my mother is allergic to spontaneity and my father treats love like a public relations strategy. I watched that clip twice because the second time I needed to make sure I had not hallucinated the part where my mother said, "For all your hard work, sweetheart," and my father added, "We're so proud," with the cadence he uses when he introduces speakers at Chamber of Commerce breakfasts, and I do not mind telling you that the fork shook in my hand in a way that would have made a better person put the phone down, but I am not that person anymore. So I scrolled the comments, all the bless you angels and heart emojis from the church ladies who send us holiday cards with their dogs and sweaters, and in the middle of that syrup I felt something inside me cool and sharpen, the way the first good snap of winter makes the air taste like a dare. And I heard myself think, quietly and clearly, I am done. People like to say the thing that breaks you is the big thing, the crash or the betrayal with fireworks, but what actually did it was that caption from my mother, "Could not love you more," posted at 10:20 in the morning on the day she had forgotten again to send me even a lazy text with a balloon, and the proof that it was not an accident but a choice lived in all the little domestic receipts they never admit to, the way my birthday always slips behind whatever Sarah is doing dance. Recitals, internships, moving apartments, now a sedan with a warranty and leather seats, because in our family there is not enough attention to go around unless you are the child who reflects best in pictures. I do not rage well, I wish I did. I wish I were the kind of woman who could flip a table at Thanksgiving and read everyone for filth and then sleep like a baby, but my version of anger is administrative. So while the video played on repeat and my phone hummed with people congratulating my sister for being chosen again, I opened my laptop and I started the quiet kind of war, the kind that does not need a witness. First by pulling up the family group thread and setting the chat to archived so far. Down the screen it would take a shovel to find it, then by removing my card information from the streaming services I pay for because I make more than my sister and my parents like to call that helping out. Then by logging into the cloud album and downloading every photo I ever cared about before I deleted my access like a tenant returning keys, and when I was done with that I went to the pharmacy, bought a single cheap candle, and stuck it into the cupcake I had promised myself and I ate it. Standing over the sink like a cliché, and it still tasted good because sugar does not care whether your parents remember you exist. After work I did something I should have done years ago, which was sit at my small kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and write a list titled Boundaries. And if that sounds dramatic, fine, it was, but it was also practical. Because I wrote that I would no longer explain myself when I said no, that I would not drive home for holidays if the invitation arrived as an obligation rather than a welcome, that I would not subsidize anybody's emergencies that were really poor planning in a nice outfit, and then, in handwriting I could feel in my wrist, I wrote that I would stop asking for a kind of love they do not offer me, and I would use the energy I spend rationalizing their choices to build a life that notices when I show up. And when I finished, I felt the first clean breath I had taken all day. It was only later, long after I had turned off the kitchen light and rinsed frosting off a spoon and told myself the drama was over because I had made a decision and decisions are supposed to bring peace, that I thought about the practical stuff, the paperwork and the accounts and the tedious strings families knot together over the years, which is why I pulled my credit report like a responsible adult who watches too many finance videos, and as I waited for the page to load, I tried to be noble and say I was not looking for anything except routine, but you already know I was looking for confirmation that my parents had not used my steadiness like a tool. When the report appeared, in the neat rows only a bank could love, I saw an inquiry from a dealership in our hometown and a note that looked like an echo of responsibility. And my mouth went dry in that immediate animal way because I understood in a flash that generosity in our house was often built on someone else's signature, usually mine, and the worst part was how unsurprised I felt. How every cell in me said of course they did, which is when I performed the pettiest and most satisfying act of revenge I have ever allowed myself, small enough to look like nothing and big enough to feel like oxygen, because I reached into settings and blocked my parents' numbers, my sister's number, and the family landline for good measure. And then I changed every shared password they still used out of habit, and I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch and listened to the quiet new sound of my life, knowing that by morning they would be calling and texting and spinning a story about how I had overreacted and already rehearsing my lines with God and Facebook as their witnesses, while I held in my hand the single line of proof that would let me do what came next, which, if I am honest, even I was not ready to admit out loud. When I finally blocked their numbers, I expected some echo of guilt to settle in, the kind that shows up as soon as silence becomes too loud, but instead what filled the room was relief that almost frightened me in its calmness. Like realizing you have been holding your breath for years without knowing it. The first few days felt disorienting, not because I missed them, but because I was so used to reacting, replying, explaining, apologizing before anyone had even accused me of anything. That waking up without a single message from my mother asking if I had seen Sarah's new interview or from my father reminding me that I should stay connected felt like learning a new language where the only word I knew was peace. I deleted the family thread, closed my social media accounts, and for the first time since college, I had no trace of them following my every move. I told myself that I was simply taking a break, a clean pause before I decided what came next, but deep down I knew I had already made a decision that was far more final than I wanted to admit. I moved quietly to a smaller city 2 hours away, one of those places with tree-lined streets and houses that look as if they were built to hold quiet lives. My new apartment had thin walls and creaky floors, but the air smelled like rain instead of burnt coffee and resentment. I bought cheap furniture, a second-hand desk, and a mismatched set of dishes that made every meal look a little less lonely. I started running again, something I hadn't done since Sarah took my favorite sneakers in high school and returned them stained with wine, pretending it was juice. The more distance I put between myself and that house, the more I realized that what I had called loyalty was really fear, the kind that convinces you that peace without them is somehow worse than chaos with them. The calls started after a week. Unknown numbers, voicemails left in my mother's sharp tone softened just enough to sound performative. "We just want to make sure you're safe," she said in one, her voice trembling in a way that would have fooled anyone who didn't grow up hearing her rehearse sympathy like lines in a play. Then came my father's messages, calmer, colder, with phrases like, "Family should talk," and "You're worrying your mother." I didn't respond. They switched strategies. My aunt texted next, a message that read, "Your dad's not doing well after what you did," which might have shaken me if she hadn't used the same phrasing 5 years earlier when I moved out of their house. I told myself to stay firm, that their guilt had an expiration date, but the human part of me, the daughter part, still wondered if maybe he really was sick. For 2 days I didn't sleep properly. I kept replaying old scenes in my head, like the night I drove him to the emergency room when he had chest pains and my mother cried in the passenger seat, Or the way he hugged me afterward and said, "You're a good girl, Emily." As if it were a medal I had to keep earning. That memory made me unlock my phone, hover over my aunt's number, and almost press call. But then I stopped. Because if he was really in danger, they would have called the police, not sent a message designed to provoke guilt. And I was right. I learned the truth in the most ordinary way possible, through a notice from my bank, a polite email with the subject line, "Account update required." The message mentioned a payment attempt linked to my name, one I didn't recognize. It referenced an auto loan, a monthly amount that made my chest tighten. I opened the attachment and saw it, a copy of a document with my electronic signature, identical to the one I had used for my apartment lease. The dealership name matched the photo from that Instagram post, the same place my parents had posed beside Sarah's new car. My name was listed as guarantor. That word, cold and bureaucratic, hit me harder than any insult they had ever thrown. I sat there rereading the document, the timestamp, the address, everything that proved this wasn't an accident but a plan, and a small laugh slipped out of me, the dry, unbelieving kind that belongs more to exhaustion than humor. I realized then that their panic had nothing to do with missing me. They were worried because my disappearance had interrupted their system, the neat chain of dependencies they had built on the assumption that I would always be reachable, reliable, and too sentimental to notice the fine print. I didn't confront them right away. I wanted to, but something colder took over, a calculation forming beneath the hurt. I spent the next 2 days researching what to do, calling my bank, learning how to freeze my credit, writing down every detail the representative mentioned. The process was slow and infuriating, but each action felt like a thread snapping loose from the web they had spun around me for years. Every "you're such a responsible one" had been a disguise for "you're the easiest one to use," and now that I had cut communication, their empire of control was cracking. The silence between us grew heavier, no longer peaceful but electric, filled with a tension that hummed beneath everything I did. I knew they were trying to find me, maybe even driving through my old neighborhood, calling my coworkers, replaying their favorite line, "She's sensitive, she overreacts," for whoever would listen. I should have been nervous, maybe even frightened, but all I felt was a strange steadiness, as if I had finally understood the rules of a game I had been forced to play blindfolded my entire life. Late one evening, while the city outside softened into streetlight shadows, I poured a glass of wine and reread the contract again, tracing the lines of my own forged signature with the tip of my finger. I thought about the years I spent trying to make them proud, about birthdays filled with excuses and apologies that I always accepted, and I knew this paper trail of deceit, was the perfect symmetry to every emotional debt they had ever left unpaid. When my phone buzzed with another message from a new number, this one reading, "We need to talk, it's serious," I didn't answer. I simply stared at the screen and whispered to the empty room, "It's serious now," because I stopped answering. For the first time, I understood the quiet power of vanishing. It wasn't an escape. It was a statement. A refusal to keep playing the role they had written for me. And though I didn't know it yet, the real chaos, the kind that tears the mask off everything familiar, was only just beginning to show its face. The morning after the bank email, I woke up with the kind of clarity that usually only shows up after a storm passes and the sky looks scrubbed clean. Because once you realize the people who raised you have borrowed your name like spare change to buy something shiny for the golden child, the sentimental fog evaporates and all that remains is a checklist. So I brewed coffee that tasted like decisions, opened my laptop, and began the unglamorous choreography of taking my life back one documented step at a time, starting with a fraud alert across all 3 bureaus, then a formal freeze, then an identity theft affidavit that forced me to type sentences I never imagined I would write. And as each confirmation email hit my inbox, I felt like I was snapping old strings tied to my wrists, thin and invisible, but strong enough to pull me back home whenever they wanted me, pliable and grateful. I called the lender next, expecting a maze of hold music and scripted apologies, and instead got a compliance officer with the kind of steady voice that indicates she has seen every flavor of family drama dressed up as paperwork. So I explained that the signature on that auto loan was not consent, but a counterfeit, that the phone number on the application was my mother's, that the email was one my father created for me years ago for convenience. And when she asked for proof, I sent her everything, from the screenshot of the Instagram reveal to the timestamped message from the dealership's promotional page that tagged my parents by name. And while the file uploaded, I surprised myself by keeping my tone calm and almost friendly, as if we were discussing a neighbor's fence rather than a betrayal steeped in Sunday dinners and Christmas stockings. By lunch, I had drafted a certified letter to the dealership demanding the original application, the IP addresses used for the e-sign, the recorded sales call they always say may be monitored, and the in-person delivery documents with whatever shaky initials they had convinced themselves looked like mine. And, because my anger is tidy when it wants to be, I copied the state attorney general's office, the Consumer Protection Division, and the lender's fraud department, then walked to the post office and sent those envelopes with the quiet satisfaction of a person sliding a knight into position and saying nothing because the board speaks for itself. Revenge, for me, turned out not to be a scream but a paper avalanche, and that afternoon it became a little louder when I called the insurance company listed on the policy and declared, with the authority that only a truly fed-up oldest daughter can summon, that I had never authorized any coverage in my name and would be filing a sworn statement to terminate it, which triggered a cascade I had predicted and secretly enjoyed, because the lender, now deprived of the required insurance, slapped force-placed coverage on the account at a rate that could make even the most coddled sister flinch, and the monthly payment ballooned like a parade float no one wanted to march behind. And I sat on my thrift store couch and listened to the silence of my phone with the kind of smile you hide by sipping water. The call started again from numbers I didn't recognize and then from ones I did, because guilt campaigns scale up when the budget gets tight, and when I didn't answer, my mother pivoted to a tone she reserves for fundraisers and funerals, leaving a voicemail where she whispered about family unity, about how these things can be handled privately, and I almost laughed when she said privately, as if the problem were my audacity to make noise rather than their audacity to put me on the hook. And then my father tried logic, reciting phrases like, "It's just a formality," and "You know your sister's situation," which translated into the language I finally understood as "You are our safety net, and we resent you when you notice." What I did next felt both petty and pristine, which is a combination I recommend to anyone relearning their center, because I forwarded the entire bundle of documents to the dealership's regional manager along with a timeline of every holiday where my birthday disappeared behind my sister's milestones, not because the man needed my childhood scrapbook, but because I wanted at least one stranger in a suit to understand the human math of what they'd helped arrange and whether that moved him or not. The more important thing happened 2 days later when the lender's investigator called to confirm that the electronic signature originated from my parents' home network and that the scanned in-person signature page looked suspiciously like my father's hand trying very hard to mimic my loops, which would almost be funny if it didn't hum with the same old arrogance that has followed me like a shadow since the day he told me I was good with paperwork, and looked pleased as if he had discovered fire. I hired a lawyer then, not a flashy one, but the kind who reads every line twice and smells blood in footnotes, and together we executed the kind of counter that makes bullies sit up straight, filing a sworn declaration of non-liability, a demand to void the guarantee as fraudulent, and a cease and desist letter that forbade any further use of my identity for credit, employment, or insurance, with a little addendum that if they attempted to contact me directly instead of counsel, I would treat it as harassment and respond accordingly. And while that packet made its way into the world with all its stamps and seals, I indulged in a small, spiteful kindness to myself by returning the spare house key my mother insisted I keep, not to their mailbox, but to our church's donation bin with a note that said, simply, "Doors always open, right?" which I admit was theatrical, but after years of being their backstage crew, I felt entitled to a matinee. The first visible crack arrived when a friend from our hometown texted a screenshot of a neighborhood thread where someone asked if anyone had seen a tow truck near my parents' driveway, and someone else replied with a cheerful yes and a photo of a very familiar car being coaxed onto a flatbed, and my stomach did a small, guilty flip that I let pass through me without apology, because my signature had been the bridge they used to cross into other people's praise, and I had finally raised the drawbridge. That night, just as I was trying to decide between feeling triumphant or simply tired, there was a knock at my apartment door, not the quick rhythm of a delivery, but the steady, insistent kind that means the person on the other side believes they are owed an audience, and before I even stood up I knew, with the certainty that comes from a lifetime of rehearsed entrances, that the real confrontation had finally found my new address. I stood on the other side of the peephole for a long breath that felt like a test of whether I had actually changed or was only performing strength for an empty room, because when the knock came again, steady, polite, full of entitlement, I saw Sarah's face in the fisheye glass, flawless makeup despite the red rims of her eyes, a face that could convince strangers to hand over late fees and apologies in the same sentence, and I knew that if I opened the door without preparation she would step into my apartment and into my resolve the way she has stepped into every space I ever carved for myself, so I slid my phone into my back pocket with the recorder already rolling. Not because I wanted drama, but because I was done with the kind of truth that dissolves once the storyteller starts crying. I opened the door, and before she could launch into the speech she had practiced in the car mirror, I told her she had 5 minutes, that I would not sit, that she should say the point first and save the memories for later, and watching her recalibrate in real time was almost worth the years I had spent being the understudy to her spotlight. She started with sisterhood, with the "we grew up together" montage, with the Halloween costumes my mother sewed and the whispered secrets on bunk beds, a liturgy of nostalgia meant to soften the moment until the ask could slip through unnoticed. Yet her voice kept catching on the practical disaster she was trying to float past the rocks, because the car was gone and the lender had called her at work and our mother had cried in the pantry while our father shut himself in the office to write emails in a tone that sounded like leadership until you traced the recipients and realized they were pleading with a finance department that does not take casseroles as payment. I let the flood run until she reached the shallow part where the pitch lives, and when she finally said she needed me to fix the paperwork, to just help them sort it out, to undo whatever mess the bank thinks this is, I watched the familiar choreography of her hands, the way she pressed her palms together as if she were praying while her nails flashed like tiny warning flags, and I realized with an odd, quiet grief that the girl I used to love had grown into a woman who still believed my job was to be the cushion for her landings. I told her that adults clean their own kitchens, that I had already filed my statements, that the only mess I intended to undo was the one where my name served as a lever for someone else's convenience, and she shifted then. A small tilt that would not be visible to anyone but me, because I have seen her move from honey to vinegar so many times that my body recognized the temperature change before my brain did. She accused me of humiliating our parents, of taking private family business and turning it into a spectacle, of not understanding how hard they had worked to give us stability, and then she threw the oldest stone of all, that I was jealous. That I had always been jealous, that the car was just a symbol and I had made it into a weapon, and while the words were cheap, the strategy was not, because she aimed at my softest history, the years I spent trying to be easy to love so I would be loved at all. I did not give her the battle she wanted. I told her the investigator had traced the signature to the home network, that the dealership had been notified, that my lawyer would handle any further contact, and that if she was here to extract a promise, she would need to leave with the unpaid bill of her own choices. The crack showed up in her eyes before it reached her mouth, a hairline fracture of disbelief that someone she expected to carry her weight had set the bags down and stepped aside, and the moment her voice dropped its performance and slipped into something raw, I almost made the mistake of holding out my arms, because beneath every boundary there lives a ghost of the person who kept saying yes, yet I held the line and asked a question I already knew she would hate. Had she known about the guarantee? Had she watched our parents use my signature like an extra casserole dish they could borrow and return without washing? She looked away for only a second, but the second was enough, and in that sliver of silence I understood that complicity wears lip gloss and good intentions, and that my revenge, if we insist on calling it that, would not be a scene, it would be a mirror. I stepped into the hallway so the neighbors would witness nothing except two women talking and a door that did not swing wide, and I told her, with the kind of steady that makes people listen even when they do not want to, that I had no desire to burn the house down. That I had no interest in seeing her fail for the sake of a moral victory, that what I wanted was much simpler and much harder. I wanted the story to be accurate. I wanted the record to reflect who had done what. I wanted them to stop naming my patients as love while billing it to my credit. I gave her a copy of the cease and desist. I gave her the investigator's card. I gave her a list of resources for debt counseling because the practical part of me refuses to surrender to melodrama, and then I delivered the small, polished turn that I knew would bruise but not wound, because I told her I would be contacting the one audience our parents care about more than any algorithm, the Church Finance Committee and the community. Donors they court every spring gala to clarify that my name should not be used in any behind-the-scenes arrangements, that I would be auditing any document where a relative's identity might have helped them secure a rate or a favor, that I would not release a single statement publicly if they corrected the record privately and repaid what they owed by the end of the month, and if they chose pride over prudence, the daylight would do its work without my commentary. She called me cruel then, which was funny in the bitter way truth can be, because my plan did not involve shouting or shaming, only sunlight and signatures. And as she turned to leave, she threw a last warning over her shoulder about how her father would never forgive me and our mother would never speak to me again, which sounded less like a threat than a weather report I had already dressed for. I closed the door gently and sat with my back against it, listening to her footsteps fade and the building settle, and I realized that the worst chaos is not the noise other people make when they are angry. It is the quiet that follows when you stop feeding their story with your compliance. The recording app on my phone ticked to a stop, the screen dimmed, and just as I exhaled, a new sound cut through the hallway, a heavier knock than before, firmer, official. The kind that belongs to someone who is not here to negotiate, but to deliver something that might change the shape of everything that comes next. The knock belonged to a courier who carried himself with the neutral gravity of someone who has seen every human expression and learned to keep his own face still, and when I signed for the thick envelope with its tasteful gold-etched return address, I knew even before I broke the seal that my parents would try to pull me back into their theater under the soft lights of celebration rather than the harsh fluorescence of accountability, which turned out to be exactly right because inside lay a hand-delivered invitation to their wedding anniversary gala, complete with our family crest embossed like a promise and a handwritten line from my father that said, in a script he uses for donors and funerals, that families forgive in rooms where love is spoken out loud, along with a request that I bring whatever documentation is causing confusion so we can resolve this with grace. A phrase so carefully deranged that I had to sit down and reread it while the second envelope, thinner, bureaucratic, unforgiving, waited like an unsmiling chaperone on the table until I opened it and found the lender's determination of fraud, the cancellation of the guarantee, the statement that the account had been referred for further review of misrepresentation, and a note that any future contacts should be directed through counsel, which meant the paper mountain I had built quietly had finally become an avalanche no one could argue with, not even a man who believed reputation could outvote reality. I chose to go because not going felt like surrender disguised as boundaries, and because if there is one thing that family mythology thrives on, it is the empty chair, the absent villain whose silence can be drafted into any narrative. So I put on a simple black dress that made me feel like a witness rather than a guest. I slipped the lender's letter and the investigator's summary into a folder, and I drove back to a hometown that looked as if it had been polished for photographs, with lawns cropped like crew cuts and flags arranged at correct angles, and as I pulled into the church hall, rented, of course, to emphasize humility, my stomach did that old tremble I hate because it remembers things my mind has learned to forget. Yet I kept walking until I reached the room where my mother stood under a floral archway that hinted at a budget blown through twice, luminous and tense, and my father shook hands like a senator while Sarah clung to a flute of champagne as if she could dissolve into the bubbles if she pretended hard enough. They had rehearsed the ambush with all the craftsmanship of a pageant, because after the slideshow of their courtship and the applause from people who love a renewal of vows more than they love a mortgage payment, my father took the microphone and began a speech about endurance that wound its way toward a cautionary parable about waywardness and insults to the family name, punctuated with glances in my direction meant to baptize the room in a single, convenient interpretation of events. And when he said that some injuries must be absorbed for the sake of unity, I felt the same clean snap I had felt the day of the red ribbon car, the moment when pretending became more painful than telling the truth. So I walked to the edge of the dais where the cake waited, and I placed the folder on the table not with a flourish, but with the calm of a person delivering a receipt, and I asked, in a voice I recognized only because it did not shake, if he would like to read the document that explained why unity had become a finance term in our house. For a few heartbeats nothing moved, then the microdrama began in earnest, because as he opened the folder and saw the investigator's summary with the dates and the IP address and the description of a signature that was not mine, his expression performed a series of quick costume changes: confusion, annoyance, outrage, strategy, while my mother rushed into the space between fact and consequence with an urgent whisper about how such things should be handled within the family. And Sarah said my name like a warning and a plea, yet none of their sounds seemed to matter because the paper kept speaking in its small printed voice, steady and relentless, and the room learned in slow waves what I had been holding alone, which was not only the debt of a car, but the debt of a pattern, the tally of 1,000 moments where the narrative had been bent around a favorite child while the other one made herself useful. I did not make a speech, and I did not cry. I simply said that I forgave them for thinking my steadiness equaled consent, that I forgave myself for letting my competence become their permission structure, that I would no longer serve as a quiet line of credit in either emotional or financial currency, and that this folder represented the last time I would carry the proof into a room to ask for recognition that should have been freely given. Then I turned, not dramatically but decisively, and I walked out before they could convert my resolve into a scene they could later recast as a tantrum, because the only revenge that felt clean was the kind that did not require witnesses, only outcomes. In the days that followed, the family group text, resurrected for the gala, burst into life without me, because cousins who had admired curated images began to ask careful questions, and a neighbor who had snapped a photo of a tow truck months ago resurfaced it like a time capsule, and the church finance committee quietly circulated a reminder about properly documented donations and personal guarantees, which meant the story that once lived only in my head had entered the ecosystem that had protected my parents for years, not as gossip but as gently enforced reality, and I did not have to lift a finger beyond the ones I used to shred the last spare key still in my kitchen drawer. I do not know if Sarah will forgive me for letting consequences touch her. I do not know if my parents will ever see me as anything other than an ungrateful disruption to their choreography. I do not know if the house will sell, or if they will move, or if my mother will call one day and try a different language, and the uncertainty does not frighten me anymore, because the quiet has learned a new meaning. Sometimes I imagine a future holiday where I do not check my phone because I have aligned my expectations with what is real rather than what should be. Sometimes I wonder if my absence will teach them anything or only leave an outline they fill with resentment. And sometimes I stand at my window in the evening and feel the air settle around a life that finally sounds like mine, where the loudest decision I make is not to answer when the script demands that I play my old part, and where the most satisfying revenge is not the echo of their apologies, but the steady, unperformed fact that I no longer need them to speak in order to hear myself clearly.